What's up guys, thanks for checking out the video, and welcome back to my little Subaru-only shop here in Northern California. In today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through how you can refurbish your Subaru valve covers so you can convert it from looking something like this to something like this that's been polished to a mirror finish. It's not that hard to do. I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps that I use to bring these valve covers to this finish in this video. Thank you so much for checking out the video, guys. I'm Luke. This is a Subaru-only show. This is my little Subaru-only shop. It's a DIY Subaru channel. It's a channel where all I do is Subaru builds and race Subaru vehicles in motorsport events. It's a DIY themed channel where I walk you guys through the steps to get your Subarus back on the road and hopefully do a little racing of your own. So thanks for checking out the video, guys. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let's head into the shop so I can walk you guys through all the steps to polish those valve covers to that mirror finish. Okay, here's one of those cast aluminum valve covers. And as you guys can see, if I do a close-up, these valve covers often develop a lot of staining in the surface of that metal after being in that hot engine compartment full of oil and grease for years and years. So what we're going to do is try to remove that top layer of oxidation and oil and grease staining so that we can polish these valve covers and hopefully give them a near mirror finish at the end. Okay, so what are the steps? The first thing you want to do is you want to get a bucket of hot soapy water and you want to clean all the loose oil and debris off of that valve cover. That's definitely the first step, and I've already done that to this valve cover. And when you're doing that, make sure you grab yourself one of those blue non-scratch abrasive pads. That'll help you get all the oil and loose dirt and debris off that valve cover and get it as clean as you can before you move on to the next step. Okay, and this is the second step. The second step is busting out that sanding paper and putting in some elbow grease and sanding these valve covers. I actually start with around a 600 grit sandpaper and then move my way up incrementally to something closer to around a 2000 grit sandpaper. Now, whenever you're prepping a metal surface like this, and you're trying to bring it to a highly polished finish, you actually want to do wet sanding, which means you want to have a bucket of hot soapy water and constantly dip this sanding paper into that soaky water and rinse all the debris and the aluminum shavings that you're removing with that sandpaper into that bucket of hot soapy water. And this will be the last step. You're basically going to get some metal polishing cream, something like this. This is a product from Blue Magic, but really any of the products on the market will work just fine as long as they're designed to work with polishing aluminum. And you can apply this polishing cream with a microfiber rag, but if you get one of these polishing bonnets, that'll make the job a hell of a lot faster and actually allow you to get a better polished finish on that valve cover at the end of the day. Alright, so I'm going to start out with step one, and that is to bust out that sandpaper, and I'm going to start with that 600 grit. Okay, I'm starting with that 600 grit sandpaper. I'm going to go ahead and soak it in that water and let it sit in there for a couple minutes and totally saturate that sandpaper. Okay, that's pretty good, so I'll wrap that sandpaper around my little sanding block. Dip it in the water and make sure it's nice and wet. And we'll go ahead and we'll start applying even pressure to that metal surface as we sand it. That's really the trick whenever you do any sanding, is to apply even pressure to that surface and then make sure you're constantly removing any of that debris that you're sanding off by dunking it and soaking it back in that hot soapy water. And this hot soapy water is just dish soap and hot tap water, by the way. So we'll go ahead, keep sanding it until we remove most of that staining, because the 600 grit is the roughest grit sandpaper we're going to be using. And once we move on to the 800 grit and the 1500 grit and the 2000 grit sandpaper, those will really just be to smooth out and polish out all the scratches that the 600 grit leaves. Now, as you can see, I'm going in a horizontal fashion, but I'm actually going to mix it up and I'll start doing circles and I'll start going at diagonals as well. That's actually also the key to a good sanding job, is you want to actually think about how the surface is being sanded down and think about all the ridges and all the valleys you're creating, and you want to make sure you knock down all those ridges in the most even way. And a lot of times the way to do that is to sand one complete section in one direction and then on the next pass sand it in a different direction. That will help you knock down all those little hills and valleys on that metal surface and allow you to get a really smooth finish. Remember to keep dunking that sandpaper to remove all that debris you're taking off. Okay, now after just a few minutes of sanding, you can see that the finish on this bottom half of the valve cover is really starting to look a hell of a lot better than that top half. We've already removed most of the staining and all the oxidation that took place on the surface of this aluminum. Now to get in all these little rounded areas and all these different crevices on this valve cover, it's definitely going to take a hell of a lot of time. But at the end of the day, this is definitely just a labor of love, and the amount of time that you put into it is going to be reflected in the final product and in the way your engine looks at the end of the build. So I'm going to continue on with the 600 grit sandpaper and move on to the top half of this valve cover, and then move on to all these little nooks and crannies. And remember, you want to apply even pressure to that sandpaper and that sanding block as you go over that metal surface. And then constantly dip that pad into your hot soapy water solution to remove all the metal shavings that you're sanding off with that sandpaper. I'll also mention that the most effort is probably going to be with that 600 grit sandpaper because we're taking away the most material with that 600 grit sandpaper. We're going to take down all the oxidation and all the staining from this aluminum surface with that 600 grit sandpaper. And then the 800 grit, the 1500 grit, and the 2000 grit sandpapers will go really quickly and prep this metal surface for the final polishing step. Okay, now this valve cover on the right is completely sanded with that 600 grit sandpaper. I'm going to go ahead and call it here. I've spent about 30 or 40 minutes on this valve cover, and I don't want to spend all day. You guys will find that anytime you're doing a sanding job, it's definitely going to be a job with diminishing returns. In those first 30 or 40 minutes, you're going to get 90 or 95% of that surface material removed, but then to get that last 5 or 10%, it could take you all day, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to cut myself off at about 30 or 40 minutes of sanding per side, and I'm going to say this valve cover on the right is completely finished with that 600 grit sandpaper. This valve cover over here on the left hasn't been sanded at all. It's only been cleaned with that hot soapy water. So I'm going to go ahead and bump up that 800 grit sandpaper, and then the 1500 grit, and then the 2000 grit sandpaper, so I can remove all the sanding marks and all the little scratches in the surface before I apply that polishing compound and use that cotton polishing wheel. Okay, I'm going to bump up to that 800 grit sandpaper. Remember, since we're wet sanding it, the first thing we're going to do is soak it in that hot soapy water. And then remember to go ahead and apply even pressure as you sand this aluminum surface. Alright, I'm done with that 800 grit, and I'm going to move up to that 1500 grit wet dry sandpaper. And we'll go ahead and soak that sucker, just like we did with the other grits. Alright, and go ahead and apply even pressure and work that 1500 grit sandpaper as you smooth out all those little ridges and valleys with that 1500 grit sandpaper. Using these last two stages of sandpaper grit, the 1500 grit and 2000 grit, is really going to make a difference at the end of this job. Because without going all the way down to that fine grit, you're really not going to be able to have that mirror polish or that mirror finish on that aluminum. Okay, I've got a good sanding job with that 1500 grit sandpaper. I'm going to go ahead and move up to my final grit sandpaper, which is that 2000 grit sandpaper. So get a fresh sheet of that 2000 grit, soak it in that hot soapy water, and then go ahead and finish the sanding job. That way we're ready for that last step, which is applying that polishing compound and using that cotton polishing applicator. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start this final sanding coat with that 2000 grit sandpaper. Remember to apply an even pressure when you're using that sandpaper. That way you don't create any scratches in that surface, and you get a nice final finish. As you guys are probably figuring out from this video, this is a pretty labor-intensive task. And at the end of the day, the amount of effort you put in is really all up to you. I definitely don't want to spend all day on these valve covers, so they're not going to look perfect. But I will tell you, they're going to look 100 times better than how they looked at the start. Alright, I've completely finished sanding this valve cover on the right. I've sanded this valve cover with a 600 grit, the 800 grit, the 1500 grit, and then the 2000 grit. And when you compare this valve cover on the right to the one on the left that hasn't been sanded at all, I think you guys can see that we're starting to develop a really nice polished finish on this valve cover. Now the last step is to apply this metal polishing cream and use that cotton buffing wheel to polish this surface to the near mirror finish. Okay, now the way we're going to apply this polishing cream is basically by following the instructions on the back of the jar. And what the instructions say is to use a clean cloth to rub in this polishing cream until you see a thin black film, and then polish it off with a clean cotton buffing wheel. Anytime you're doing any polishing or any work like this on a metal surface, do it in stages, do it in sections. That way you don't have to worry about doing the whole surface all at once. I'm definitely starting to see a grayish black tint develop in this surface. And I'll go ahead and use my cotton buffing wheel to polish off that compound and leave that surface with a mirrored finish. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. That way you guys can compare the mirrored polished surface down here on the bottom to the unpolished surface on the top. Now that is a beautiful finish. And as we move up to the top, you can see there's still some little surface scratches in that top half that haven't been buffed out by that metal polish. But as we move down to the bottom, there's virtually no scratches anywhere in that surface, and it's got a virtually mirror finish. That's looking beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of this valve cover and then move on to that other valve cover. So just dip your clean rag or your paper towel in that metal polishing and apply it to that surface, and then rub it in until you see that gray black film develop. I actually have several different sizes and shapes of this cotton polishing wheel. That makes it a lot easier to get in all the different crevices of this valve cover. And then to get all the final little crevices, you're probably gonna have to use a paper towel or a clean rag. So go ahead and polish it with a clean rag or a paper towel to get all the little bits of that polishing cream off of that valve cover. Okay guys, this is the final product. The valve cover here on the right has been fully sanded and fully polished, and this is as good as it's gonna get. And I'm telling you, this thing looks amazing in person. The valve cover over here on the left has been washed with soap and water, but it hasn't been sanded and it hasn't been polished. So this is a great comparison to get an idea of what that valve cover is gonna look like before you do the sanding and the polish, and then after you do the sanding and the polish. I'm gonna go ahead and grab the camera and give you guys a close-up view so you can really see how amazing the surface of this valve cover looks. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there for today, guys. I think this valve cover turned out awesome, and I hope it gave you guys an idea of how to restore or refurbish those valve covers on your Subaru. Thank you so much for checking out the video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comments section. And if you like this video, please go ahead and give it a like. I'm Luke. This is the Subaru Only Show. Until next time, guys. Later!